All right, and here we go, kind of to wrap it up. We've been looking at the Miranda understanding of capacity in juveniles, and psychologists are going to favor kind of the per se approach. On average, juveniles will not do this as well as adults. The courts, though, have adopted the totality approach, that is taking total look at all of the circumstances in making the decision rather than on an average basis, as psychologists might be tempted to do. Now, we've talked about this a little bit. It formed one of our test questions, or kind of informed one of our test questions. Big question: do abused children become criminals in greater proportions? And it's an interesting question. How the hell do you answer it? Well, if you want to do the research, one thing you can do is you can go back and retrospective accounts. So I go to prison and I start interviewing prisoners. That is, people who are convicted criminals. And I say, hey, what was your childhood like? Right? And so we can ask adult criminals if they were abused. The problem is then we're not looking at a non-criminal sample for comparison's sake, so it really doesn't answer the question. And how many of you believe that it's possible that at least a significant proportion of criminals don't want to take responsibility, so they might be likely to engage, I mean they might be able to, more likely to offer excuses in terms of poor upbringing as an excuse for their action, right? So retrospective accounts are going to be fraught with problems and probably not be all that reliable. So we conduct prospective studies. What do you think? We flip it around, we go the other way. What we do is we find children that are abused and then we follow them. And we follow them until they become adults and see if they show an increased. And it's like, oh shit, no, we can't do that because, well, first of all, it's freaking really totally unethical, right? Because if a child's being abused, we just allow them to continue to be abused and then see if it affects criminal behavior? Probably not, right? I don't think we're going to get that past an IRB. At least we shouldn't be able to, if nothing else, right? As an aside, when I used to teach lifespan development at Columbus State, at the beginning class I'd say, you know, there's going to be a lot of things that we're not going to be able to answer questions about in child development and adolescent development. And we can't because it would be unethical to do so. But I say there's so many variables that exist that makes it almost impossible to measure. But I said if it was possible, if you could give me 1,000 infants, right? Just give me 1,000 infants and let me randomly assign them to experimental conditions, like here's a good home, I'm going to assign these 20 infants to this good home, here's a home where abuse occurs, I'm going to assign 20 infants, and people are like, wait, you can't. And that's right, you can't, because it would be unethical. But notice, the experimental method often produces good data, but isn't ethical to use under certain circumstances, especially with children. So, no, I doubt that we're going to call it ethical. And so many of these remain somewhat mysterious to us. Now, let's talk about a juvenile's right to self-determination. Now, nurturance rights are rights that are guaranteed to us because we're human beings and children human beings. So we're entitled to protection, we're entitled to sustenance, food, water, etc., and other benefits, education. And if our parents fall short of this, then social services can be called and we can be removed from the home, or the parents can be corrected in their behaviors, right? So these nurturant rights are absolutely guaranteed to you and are expectancies. Now, self-determination rights are in a different ballpark. Self-determination rights, to what extent, and let's put this at the adolescent point, I mean, it makes a little more sense there. Do you have the right to exercise control over your environment? For example, let's suppose you have two parents that should get divorced, that these are horrible parents, constantly bickering, fighting, making children choose sides, etc. At some point, can children say, you guys have done such a horrible job of running this household, we want to divorce your house? That is, we want to divorce ourselves from our parents, right? To what extent should adolescents have that type of level of control over their own environment? If the parents are creating a toxic environment, to what extent could the children maybe make it not happen? Can they make independent choices about their well-being? Let's say you're a 16-year-old, your parents are doing you no favors your whole life, you got a job at 15, you've been doing this job for 16, you're going to school, you know, home is just about the only the only point of home is where you sleep, right? You're already feeding yourself, educating yourself. To what extent should you be able to move out? That is, to become an emancipated minor and then make adult level decisions for yourself at that point in time, make independent choices, right? Now, others are perhaps less earth-shattering than those that I've just described. I want to take a look at the case of Tinker in Des Moines. To what extent do juveniles possess a fundamental right to free speech? And we can see the picture here of they've got these black armbands with peace symbols, and during the Vietnam War, see 1969, they wanted to wear these in school as a protest to the war. The school said, take that shit off, you can't wear that stuff. And they said, yes we can, because we are protected, we have First Amendment free speech rights. Well, the courts finally looked at this and they said, here's the deal. It doesn't seem to present a distraction. It is a legitimate expression of free speech. It doesn't appear to be causing any harm or confusion. So we're going to maintain the right of these juveniles then to in fact wear their armbands. And it's funny, back in what, 71, I had a similar situation. I was in middle school at Robert Fulton Junior High School, because we had junior high schools in California, 7th, 8th, and 9th grade. And in 1971, we had a newspaper for the school, right? And it was a student newspaper. It was attached to our journalism class. And we put out a newspaper every week, but the way it worked was we had one group put out a newspaper, half the class, and then the other half the class put out the other half of the newspaper. So we had 2 weeks to do the newspaper because it only came out every week. So there's two. And I was the editor of the North paper. There's North versus South. I was the editor of the North paper, if you will. And you know, a junior high paper. What's a teacher's favorite color? What's their favorite meal? You know, it was a bunch of this nonsense reporting about shit that nobody cared about. And people on my paper, we wanted to write about the war. We wanted to write about the Vietnam War. We wanted to write about our brothers, our cousins, etc., who were being swept up in the war and how it was affecting them. And our journalism teacher went on sabbatical, so we had a new journalism teacher, and she said, under no circumstances can you write about the war or anything like it. And we said, yes we can, and yes we will write about the war, because we have a First Amendment right, and we're empowered to do so. And as we attempted to, she quashed our paper and she said, either do what I say or I'm going to fail y'all. We said, screw her, we're going to write about the war. And so she failed us all. And that was pretty significant, you know, when you have 15, 18 students get failed for this. And parents got all pissed off, and they went to the school and they talked to the principal. And it was an interesting compromise, because they said, well, yeah, we can't fail these students on the basis of their principles and what they want to write about. But at the same time, we don't want students running the school, so to speak, and making choices, usurping the journalism teacher. So it was a tough spot for the school, and I have to admire what they did, because what they said is, okay, if you guys are not willing to go back on it and just write the paper as we say, we're going to make available to you this new class called Issues Today. And it will be a writing class, and you'll be able to write whatever you want to write, not for publication, but you'll be able to research and write about whatever you want. And Mr. Pruss, a new young teacher, will lead the class, and we all liked him. So they had us work independently from that point on. But we no longer worked on the school paper as a result of this. And these were important issues to kids back in the day. And so many of us took this seriously, you know. Now, Morse versus Frederick kind of limited in range of free speech. And you can see down below here, there's this big banner that says, "Bong hits for Jesus." Well, in fact, this young man, at the end of school one day, when people were going out to the buses, decided to put up this big banner that said "Bong hits for Jesus" across the street from the school, and got in big trouble with the school. And they said, no, you can't put that up. And he tried to cite Tinker in Des Moines, but they said "Bong hits for Jesus" is encouraging drug use, and this is not useful or effective. So in fact, he lost his case. There will be no bong hits for Jesus, at least outside of that school. So Some other issues, and I don't want to get opinionated about this, it's not my point. Abortion, and this is a tough one because states, the laws are generated on a state-by-state basis. Now, for some abortions, for a juvenile, let's say a 15-year-old young lady wants to get an abortion, it depends on the state. Some states require that if you want to get an abortion, then you have to have parental notification. You have to tell your parents, right? Now, other states were more restrictive. They said not only do you have to tell your parents, but you have to come back with signed parental consent. Other states did not require this. So to what extent should this be necessary, right? And you can imagine that a young woman gets herself into trouble and maybe her parents are not very understanding and they say, literally, my parents will kill me if I tell them about this, right? Perhaps, to just set up that scenario. So Planned Parenthood versus Central Missouri versus Danforth, 76, unconstitutionality of required consent for abortion in the first trimester. So back then, and you can see this is 76, right? The idea was that this would be unconstitutional to require consent within the first trimester. So since then, what's occurred is kind of this compromise situation, and again, depends on the state, right? Notification with judicial bypass procedure is typical. So they say parents have to be notified, but if a young lady is so worried about her parents' reaction, like, a threat of physical violence or some such, then the young woman can petition a judge, go directly to a judge and say, Your Honor, I need an abortion and I'm afraid to tell my parents, and then she presents her case, and the judge can then rule to allow her or not to get the abortion by bypassing the parental notification if the case seems to warrant it. But again, these laws are up for grabs and constantly shifting. So what we know now is there's a trend towards greater and greater restrictions. Okay? Now, one thing that we can ask about at this point in time, and let's go back to the idea that juveniles might have problems with cost-benefit analysis, and that is that their prefrontal cortex isn't necessarily fully equipped to do good cost-benefit analysis. Are juveniles capable of making the best decision for themselves, and under what contexts? And we can take that as a per se statement in general, but then we can also flip it back around and go to kind of totality explanation. Are there circumstances where parents are maybe so dangerous to the juvenile that in fact the consent should be waived? So again, back and forth, who knows? There's just so much to think about in that regard. Other domains for juvenile self-determination, well, adoption. And let's face it, if we look at, you can check out Bastard Nation as adoptee rights organization, so if any of you are adopted and interested in the discussion about being adopted or your rights, you can go ahead and check out Bastard Nation. This is an organization we founded back in the 90s. I'm an adoptee, so the strange thing is, I was born in Los Angeles, California, and I think that's a solid, right? And I think the date that they gave me was a solid. I have found my birth mother through various research. Not too long ago, through DNA, believe it or not, through 23andMe, I found my half-sister. So my biological father, right, impregnated two different women. My half-sister, who's 6 years younger than me, Rachel, and then me, right? It's fascinating. DNA testing is blowing the lid off this adoption secrecy bullshit. And I do believe it's bullshit. That's my opinion, but I'm adopted, so I guess we're going to live with it, at least through this lecture. Moving away from children as property, and basically that's what I was. I was property. I was unwanted by my birth mother. There was no place for me in her life. So what she did is give me to the Children's Home Society in Los Angeles, who's going to provide me to a couple who wants a child. And the cost of doing that is about $10,000, right? What you're looking at is basically adoptees are sold to people who can afford to purchase them, who can't have their own children. If you look at my birth certificate from the county of Los Angeles in the state of California, it lists my adopted mother and adopted father as my parents. So by all practical reviews of this document, they are in fact presented as my biological parents, which they're not. They're my adoptive parents. So the document certifying my birth, which is the core document to getting a driver's license, a social security card, voting, passport, all this shit, is a lie. It's patently untrue, and yet it's accepted as a legal document. And that, you know, is kind of problematic. So can we move away? Do I have a right to records, right? And I don't, still to this day, right? All the records I found have been kind of on the down low. Right? Do you have a right to contact birth parents? Well, I did. It's an interesting call. Hey, you don't know me, but I'm your son, right? Which is what I did with my birth mother, etc. And she wouldn't tell me who my birth father was. And I didn't find that out until I found my half-sister, and she had done the investigation on that. And we were both saddened because our birth father died many years ago, around 2000. So, but we did find, through him, his younger sister, who we've both contacted and visited. So we have this whole different life, and it's all very strange and weird. But to what extent do I not have the right to know any of that about myself, these core ideas? And remember, as we look at the role of genetics as becoming increasingly explanatory, to what extent is it appropriate to hide that information from me? So, to what extent do we have these rights, and who is going to issue these rights? So, you know, gender reassignment surgery to me is kind of a strange one that we know so little about at this point in time. Let's suppose that an infant is born, here pops out of the chute, if you will, and you know, the old cliche, they pick a child up by its ankles and they hold it up, smack it on the ass to get it a good cry, and then they say, congratulations, it's a, and they look at the genitalia and let's say it's indistinct. Let's say there's a little of both or not much of either, right? And they say it's a, and at this point, what do, right? Well, often parents are asked at that point in time to make a decision, and the gender reassignment is performed on the newborn. Is that legit? Is that something that should be suspended, right? Whose right is that to decide? Should it be done shortly after birth? Or should the child make a choice in the adolescent when hormones and other things kind of play out and make the decision that makes the most sense for the individual? Who should be making that decision? Whose right is it? And again, these are kind of just strange questions. I don't have an opinion on this one, but consider. And what happens if it's done wrong, right? What if we assign a gender and then find out it wasn't the correct gender and then have to do reassignment surgery? So consider that. Let's, a little kind of on the light side, circumcision. Notice that most males in this country, at least at one point in time, were circumcised. And this is something that's done right at birth. Right, here we go. Right at birth, or maybe not at birth, but just a little bit later, we circumcise the infant. What if the infant didn't want to be circumcised? I know, it's silly, but whose choice is it? But obviously, it's much better to do it to an infant than it is to an adult. I mean, my Uncle Lou had it done when he was, you know, drafted into the Army in World War II, and he said that's no joy having a circumcision at 18 years old, and I can imagine not. But now that we've discovered infants can feel pain, which science told us they couldn't back then, like when I was given, you know, who knows? It's a mess. Who should make that decision? When should it be made? Whose right is it? And then we referred slightly to the emancipated minor status in an earlier example. To what extent should a juvenile be released from their parents if their parents have created a toxic environment and are of no use or help to the children? To what extent can juveniles go to court and present that and make that case for managing their own life? So I hope we've asked some big questions here and you kind of consider those. They're not questions that necessarily require answers from us at any time in the near future. We've also covered the transition from the due process model to the crime control model and spoken about some specific cases that are representative of that. Anyway, that's it. So I'm going to call it good. I'll wake up Penelope one more time here, and you guys I hope you're having a good day. I hope you're staying healthy, and I hope you're staying safe. Penelope, you gonna say goodbye? Yeah, she's got that look of waking up with just too much light in her eyes. And of course, when you're a one-eyed cat, you always look half asleep anyway, right? So, you guys take care, and I'll talk to you later.